with Russia, we were talking about whether or not the president should go heavy on meddling with the election when he meets with Vladimir Putin. You want to make sure that the Russia sanctions bill gets moving again. What's going on?
That bill now, having been passed overwhelmingly by the United States Senate, 98-2, is stalled in the House because largely the Trump administration has resisted it. And this bill would provide for much stronger sanctions against the energy and financial sectors.
Why would the House of Representatives, a conservative institution, try to stand in the way of a sanctions bill that would keep Vladimir Putin in check and stop him from trying to rig the next election?
The excuse is that it is a revenue-raising measure, which, as you'll recall from your days in the House, has to begin in the House. And this one began in the Senate. It was passed with overwhelming bipartisan support.
So it's a procedural concern?
And that's the excuse.
Well, so why don't they just pass their own version?
That's not really what's
that
going
is not
on.
really the reason. The mystery is, why hasn't the Trump administration taken a forceful stand in supporting this measure? And it could be
opposing it.
Well, why hasn't it supported passage of the sanctions bill?
So Noah, why would, I mean, commentary certainly would support the Senate bill, right? Why would conservatives oppose sanctions against Putin right now?
Well, I can't speak for my magazine, but I can say that I suppose the charitable explanation for the White House's objection is that this takes a power away from the White House to implement sanctions that they've traditionally had, and the executive branch is going to fight for its authority versus the legislative branch. That's how the system is envisioned. In the event
that is an excuse as well, pardon me for interrupting, because it actually codifies and strengthens those sanctions and authorizes the president to take additional sanctions against the mining, metal, shipping, and rail interests of Russia. So it actually strengthens the president's hand. For example, it enables him to take action against interference in democratic institutions, which obviously the Russians did in the United States and elsewhere.
So, but no, so that could be an argument. At the same time, though, you can't speak for the magazine, but you would support. Do you support what happened in the Senate?
I think it's necessary because of the extraordinary nature of this presidency's relationship with Russia. I'd like to see the Congress reassert itself when it comes to foreign affairs, particularly in this avenue. We don't know what the House is going to come up with. What is the threshold at which you and Senate Democrats would decline to support a weaker version of this bill?
There is no question that this bill has support in the House, and it would be passed in the House if the Trump administration gives the green light. And the mystery is, why haven't they? And I think it has to do possibly with the financial interests and business dealings that Donald Trump has in Russia, as well as the possibility that he's simply resisting the meddling investigation conducted now by the special prosecutor.
I think those are all possibilities. I think we're dancing around a little more high-minded issue, which is how much power should the executive have, how much power should Congress have. And the position that the administration is taking is that this puts too much power in the hands of Congress to decide when these sanctions come off, approve things, and so on and so forth, taking power that was traditionally in the hands of the executive away. Now, I think Trump has nobody to blame for himself because nobody trusts him to do, quote, the right thing on Russia, and so Congress wants to have more of a say in it. But I think in a perfect world, this would represent a diminution of executive power from what has traditionally been exercised.
But Mika, we're far from a perfect world.
It's hard, it's hard not to connect the dots here between this president and an unseemly lenience toward what could be the biggest threat to face this country in the next 10 years, especially if our elections are being impacted by Russia, which it appears it is.
And here's connecting a few more dots. Russia has to be convinced, Putin has to be compelled to be aware that Russia will pay a price. It has to be more than a jab or a punch in this conversation on Friday. It has to be a compelling statement by the President of the United States that our country will not tolerate this kind of meddling, and Russia will pay a price.
Julie Pace.
What would be the reasons not to do that?
Well, I think we're talking about Trump and Russia, and we keep coming back to this theme of why won't he just say that the Russians meddled in the election? Why won't he just support a bill that would tighten sanctions on Russia? And there are no good answers, and that's where the problem lies for the White House, that there is no clean answer on either side of this that doesn't lead you to believe that Trump, for whatever reason, wants to take a friendly posture toward Moscow. But I wanted to pick up on this question to the senator about where the Congress fits into national security decision-making on North Korea in particular. We were talking earlier about possible military options. It's unclear whether this is something the Trump administration is looking at right now, but going forward, what is the role of Congress if the president says he wants to take military action unilaterally on North Korea? Does Congress have a role in authorizing that, or do you believe that this is something that the president could do on his own?
I think Congress has a clear role and a necessary role. I have long favored the authorization for the use of military force to be revised with respect to what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Middle East. And we have asked, as a matter of fact, Senators Cardin and McCain have led this effort to demand that the president come forward with a strategy that would justify any military action. So there has to be a comprehensive look at this part of the world, and Congress certainly has a role to play if there is going to be the use of military force. But I think that there are no good answers in North Korea. There are some very good answers with respect to Russia, which is make them pay a price in these additional sanctions. There ought to be national unity that demands the president really support this sanctions bill and get it through right away.
And there certainly was almost national complete unity in the Senate. So, Frank, it's interesting. We're now asking, the question was asked about 3 minutes ago, why? Why would he oppose Russian sanctions? Why would he get in the way? Why would he? Well, there's always a why surrounding Russia. And you can go back to December of 2015. We had Donald Trump on the show in December of 2015 saying, well, what do you think about Vladimir Putin? He likes him, he's a strong leader, unlike our own president. But he kills journalists. Well, we kill a lot of people.
We're guilty of a lot of things ourselves.
He's a strong... And we kept going, and he just refused to condemn the political assassinations. Right. He refused to condemn the assassinations against journalists. And it wasn't until we asked him a leading question, an aggressive leading question, he goes, oh, yeah, sure I do. But there's always a why around it.
Yeah. No, it's a truly perverse thing, and we could fill in so many other things, like the moment during that presidential forum when he said Putin was a much stronger leader than Obama, which seemed like a gratuitous thing to do.
The interview with Bill O'Reilly, when he once again said our soldiers in Iraq killed a lot of people.
And at this point, it's hard to know how much of it is pure obstinacy. People have been asking him to do these things for so long, and he's digging his heels in. But I agree with the senator entirely. I mean, sanctions are necessary. He needs to do more than punch or jab at the beginning of this meeting with Putin. He needs to kind of say what Americans have been waiting for him to say for a very long time. And the more he doesn't do it, the less people feel they can trust him on the Russian front, and the more these questions, you say, why? These questions are going to haunt his entire presidency unless he does those things that he clearly should in terms of sanctions and in terms of acknowledging and condemning Russian meddling.
You know, people talk about, Mika, how his tweets are not in his best interest.
Yes.
I would say his continuing to be obsequious to Vladimir Putin actually undercuts his authority as a president to do so many things.
I think both of those things undercut his presidency, especially on the world stage.
Because there's no way, Senator, is there, that the Senate or the House or anybody who's actually gives a damn about our relationship with Russia and our standing in the world can look at how obsequious he's been towards Vladimir Putin over the past 20 months, 24 months, and not say there has to be something there. So if he's not going to uphold international norms, then we in the Senate and we in the House are going to have to.
And the question is, and I think you put it very well, Joe, on the issue of trust, is he putting our national interest first, or his ego, or his financial and business dealings? That's one reason why 200 of us have sued the President of the United States, because the question is whether he's putting the national interest ahead of his financial dealings, which he has failed to disclose, whether it's the Chinese trademarks or the payments by the Saudis of $250,000 for his properties and
His
rental.
first trip, of course.
There has to be disclosure. We can't consent to what we don't know, and the requirement in the Constitution is
Right.
that Congress consent.
Senator Richard Blumenthal,
Speaking of
thank you.
Congress, the House of Representatives needs to put a discharge petition
To step up.
on the floor. They have got to pass the Senate sanctions bill, and hopefully pressure will rise on them to do the right thing.
Senator,
Hear, hear.
thank you so much.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.